Hey class. This week we have been talking about new movements that have happened in the colonies, maybe some revivals. We talked about new science ideas. We've talked about John Locke and his theory of, the natural rights that people have, like the right to life, liberty, and property. We talked about how we adapted those whenever we became the United States of America, and how we switched those to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We talked about that. We also talked about the Enlightenment thinkers and what they did and their ideas and how they started moving more towards reasoning. And then we started talking about the Great Awakening, where people were, going back to the church, and, they were using this preaching where it would scare people, speak to their emotions, kind of make them fearful. And so it would eventually make them go back to the church because they were fearful. They were scared if they didn't baptize their children or if they weren't members of the church, what would happen. And so it's this big movement in the colonies where people start going back to church because people had gotten obsessed with, the materialistic items, things of this world, and they had lost their focus on Jesus. They started focusing on finding gold and, building settlements and whatever it was that they were doing in their daily life in the colonies. And they didn't really focus on, God and going back to church. We also saw where the colonies were moving away from being like a biblical democracy and being more of just a regular democracy, meaning they don't have as much biblical influence on their government as they did. So we're kind of starting to see more of a separation of church and state for the first time, which is another theme that's going to be prevalent in America. Even today, we still have that. It's one of the, the principles in our Constitution. You have the freedom of religion and the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, very important right that we have. And so we see that they move from allowing people who were church members, white males who were church members, they were the only ones that could vote, to now it's white males who own property. So you don't have to just be a church member to vote. And that was less than 50% of people in the communities that were allowed to vote. But it's a step towards, the democracy that we have today and a step away from the biblical democracy that they had at the time period. Some other things we talked about were the Dominion of New England and the New England Confederation. We talked about the Navigation Acts, all of these things that were kind of an extension of the king's power. That's what we described them as. The New England Confederation was, just a loose union of those New England colonies that worked together to have the main goal of defense, but it shows that they're wanting to work together and they're being independent from the king, from Britain. So that's something interesting. And then the Dominion of New England is where the king is trying to exert his power. Remember, he sends Edmund Andros over to come and take over basically the colonies and be in charge and collect money. He takes away charters. He takes away things dealing with property and schools. He just makes sure to exert his power for the king and let them know that the king is in charge. So I guess the king saw the colonies starting to be more independent, starting to have their own types of government, and he didn't like that. And so he wanted to make sure they knew that he was in charge. And then the Navigation Acts are also a really good example of this, where, it limits trade. The colonies are only allowed to trade within the British Empire. They're only allowed to use British ships. And this is where we start seeing the colonists getting upset, getting angry about the principle of it, because although it didn't really negatively affect them at the time, they were upset that it was a rule, that it was a law, that it was something the king could at any time enforce if he wanted to. So they were upset about that. So we have a lot of themes going on where we're starting to be more American, we're starting to be democratic, we're starting to have our own ideals and beliefs away from the British Empire, away from the king. And the king's starting to see that and doesn't really like it. And those are just some examples. We talked about the fundamental orders, the Mayflower Compact, we talked about the Pilgrims, the Puritans, all of those things, all of those people, those groups, and what they set up and the kind of economies they had, and, just how they were trying to be democratic on their own. And so that's a really big example of where we're going. And we know our country today is, we're a democracy, and that's a very important theme of America. So very interesting. It's a lot, but we've been building upon it. We've been talking about the economies, the northern industrial economy, the southern agricultural economy, and then the mixed economy of the middle colonies. So a lot that we've been talking about, a lot that we're going to continue talking about, and eventually we're going to get to the American Revolution. So that's really a lot of information, juicy. We're going to talk about the different things that happened, the different areas where the colonists were upset, where they were angry, the taxes, the acts, whatever was passed. And we'll talk about how, although they didn't really have so much of a negative impact on the colonists, they were upset with them because of the principle of the matter, the fact that they made those laws or rules and could at any time enforce them, or, just exerting power over them. So just keep all that in mind. We're going to talk about it. We'll build upon everything that we already know, and we'll continue to learn. So stay tuned for more history.